There are places in this world that feel wrong the moment you step inside them. You can't always explain it, it's not something you can point to or put into words. It's more like a quiet warning that rises up from somewhere deep in your chest, something primal and ancient that your body knows long before your mind catches up. Most of the time, we brush that feeling aside. We tell ourselves we're being dramatic, that we're letting our imaginations run wild, that there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. And honestly, most of the time, we're right. A strange noise turns out to be the pipes settling. A shadow in the window turns out to be a passing car. A locked door turns out to have been locked all along. But sometimes, not often, thank God, but sometimes, that feeling is telling you the absolute truth. Tonight, I want to share 3 stories with you. 3 real accounts from real people who found themselves in situations that started out as perfectly ordinary moments, a quiet holiday trip, a solo vacation drive, a stay at a small-town hotel, and slowly, quietly, terrifyingly transformed into something they will never be able to fully shake. These aren't ghost stories. There are no monsters with claws or creatures from another world. In some ways, that makes them worse. Because the things that happen in these stories exist in the same world you and I live in every single day. The first account involves a man who returned to a hometown he never loved, only to discover that the hotel he was sleeping in each night may not have been a hotel at all anymore, and that the man handing him a room key may not have been who he appeared to be. The second story follows someone who spent what was supposed to be a peaceful, solitary day at a family cabin in the mountains, only to realize far too late that the cabin had already been occupied, and not by anyone she invited. And the third story takes us to a foggy stretch of highway in northern Oregon, where a solo traveler ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere and found herself walking through the dark with something, or several somethings, keeping pace with her through the trees. If this is your first time visiting our channel, I want to welcome you warmly. Please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We share true accounts just like these every week, and our community here means the world to us. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. And let's begin. Story 1, The Hotel That Wasn't Open. I had taken a small vacation over New Year's to go back to my hometown and spend some time with my 2 brothers and a handful of close friends. And let me be honest with you right from the start, I have never had warm feelings about that place. The moment I was old enough and had enough money saved, I packed my things and left without looking back. It was one of those towns that felt frozen in time, not in a charming, nostalgic sort of way, but in a way that felt forgotten. The kind of place that the rest of the world had simply moved on from. There were no neighboring towns nearby, no cities within easy driving distance, nothing but open land and old buildings and roads that hadn't been properly maintained in years. The people who still lived there were mostly the ones who had always lived there, people who had either chosen to stay or had simply never found a way out. My brothers and my closest friends were the only things that ever drew me back, and even then, my visits were brief and purposeful. That particular year, my usual arrangement had changed. On previous trips, I would stay the week at one of my brothers' houses. But both of them had recently started serious relationships, and their girlfriends had moved in with them. As much as I loved my brothers, I wasn't about to spend my holiday as the odd one out, sleeping on their couch while they navigated their new domestic lives. So I looked into other options. The only hotel in town was a small, nondescript family-run place sitting just off the gravel highway at the edge of town. I say hotel, but even that word feels generous. It didn't have a sign with a name on it. No logo, no marquee, nothing. The word painted on the front just said hotel. That was it. Plain and simple, as if the person who had named it had run out of imagination before they even got started. I arrived quite late that evening. When I pulled into the parking lot, the entire lot was empty save for one old truck parked near the entrance. That detail struck me at the time, though I couldn't have told you why. I pushed through the front door and walked into the lobby, which was lit by a single lamp sitting on or near the front counter. The light was dim and yellowish and cast more shadow than it chased away. The moment I walked in, a man rose from a chair behind the counter, startled, or at least that was the impression I got. He had a scruffy beard, hair that had grown out long and unevenly, and the look of a man who spent most of his time alone. He appeared to be somewhere in his 60s. He stared at me for a moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice came out low and rough, like gravel rolling around in a tin can. He said, "Need a room?" Just that. No greeting, no smile. He handed over a key and walked me down to the room at the very end of the hallway. The interior of that hotel was old. Not crumbling, not falling apart, but old in the way that things get when nobody has really cared for them in a long time. There was a particular kind of staleness to the air, a dinginess that no amount of cleaning would fully lift. My room was small and bare. A bed sat squarely in the center. A television faced it from across the room. That was essentially it. But honestly, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't planning to spend my days there. I'd be out with my family and friends from morning until night. This room was simply a place to rest my head. I left my suitcase packed, took a quick shower to wash off the road, and fell asleep without much trouble. I woke up somewhere around 3 in the morning to the sound of knocking. Not at my door, further away, deeper in the hallway. I lay there in the dark and listened through the thin walls. Slow, spaced out sounds. Soft thuds, then silence, then a few more. It reminded me of the way an old wooden door sounds when it opens and closes repeatedly, the frame absorbing each impact with a dull thump. I stayed still and listened for a while, turning it over in my mind. This was not exactly a premium establishment. Strange noises in an old building at 3 in the morning weren't exactly cause for alarm. I convinced myself it was nothing and drifted back off to sleep. The next morning I woke up with plans to get coffee before heading out for the day. I walked up to the lobby and found it empty. Completely empty. No coffee station, no vending machine, not even a pot sitting on a warmer. The front desk was unattended, and there was no sign of the old man or anyone else who might have been on staff. It felt odd, but I brushed it aside. I left, spent the day with my brothers, and didn't make it back until close to 9 that evening. The parking lot looked exactly the same as the night before. Still just that one old truck, parked in the same spot. Inside the hotel, the lobby lights were off now, and the air felt even colder than it had the previous night. The old man was nowhere to be seen. I walked down the hallway to my room, locked the door behind me, and changed into something more comfortable. And then I heard it again. Those same sounds. 2 or 3 slow, heavy thuds, and then silence. But this time they were closer. Much closer. Close enough that it sounded like they were coming from just outside my door rather than from the far end of the hallway. I crossed the room carefully and eased my door open just a crack, peering out into the dim hallway with one eye. I had barely a second to notice that the door directly next to mine was slightly open before the man's voice rang out from the far end of the hallway and made me jump so hard my heart nearly stopped. He called out to me, telling me to come down to the lobby. Before I could even draw a breath to respond, he turned and walked back out of view. He gave no reason, no explanation. Just the instruction, and then he was gone. My skin was crawling. Something about the whole thing felt deeply, profoundly off. And yet I felt somehow compelled to go. Maybe there was something wrong with my room. Maybe he had information I needed. I told myself a story about reasonable explanations and walked myself down that hallway. The lobby was still dark when I arrived at the end of the hall. And the old man wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere that I could see. I couldn't hear footsteps. I couldn't hear movement of any kind. The whole building was silent around me, and standing there alone in the dark with the absence of him pressing in on all sides, I felt a fear that was very difficult to put into words. It wasn't logical, and it wasn't dramatic, it was just a quiet, bone-deep certainty that I did not want to be in that building for another second. I turned around and walked quickly back to my room, locked the door, and stayed up far too late listening to the silence. I never heard him moving around inside the building again that night. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist the moment I turned to go back to my room. The next morning, when I met up with my friends, I told them about the strangeness of the hotel. Their reactions weren't what I expected. Every single one of them looked confused. And after a moment of trading glances with each other, they all said more or less the same thing: they were pretty sure that hotel had closed down. A year or two back, maybe. They weren't completely certain. If I was staying there, they said. Then maybe they were wrong. But the seed had been planted. And as I spent the rest of that day trying to enjoy myself, I kept coming back to it. On my drive back that night, I went over it again and again in my mind. The place couldn't be shut down. The electricity was working. The water was running. The man had been there to check me in. These were the arguments I made to myself. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot, that same empty lot, that same lone truck, I had mostly talked myself out of my unease. But when I walked down the hall to my room, I stopped cold. My door was open. Just a crack. But it was open, and I had left it locked. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a very long time, staring at that thin line of dark between the door and the frame. Then I pushed it open slowly. The room was dark. My suitcase was sitting where I had left it, still mostly packed. And in that moment, I made a decision that I believe was one of the better decisions of my life. I walked in quickly, grabbed that suitcase, and didn't stop to collect anything else. A toothbrush and a few miscellaneous items that were still in there, I left them all without a second thought. Nothing in that room was worth the time it would take to gather it. I moved fast. My gut was screaming at me by that point, not whispering anymore but screaming, and I listened to it. I got to the end of the hallway and stepped into the dark lobby and started moving toward the exit when something made me look back. I don't know what it was. Maybe I heard something without quite registering it. Maybe it was just instinct. When I turned my head and looked back down the hallway, every nerve in my body fired at once. The old man was standing in the doorway of my room. He was staring directly at me from the far end of the hall. Not moving. Just watching. I ran. I got to my car, started the engine, and drove straight to my brother's house without stopping once to breathe properly. My brother urged me to call the police. Even in the best-case scenario, someone had been in my room, and that was worth reporting. So I did. What the police told us was far worse than I had anticipated. My friends had been right. The hotel was closed. Not collapsed, not razed to the ground, but officially shut down. The owners had left the area a couple of years back and had simply left the building behind, still connected to the power grid, just sitting there vacant. And when the officers went to search the property, they found no trace of the old man. No sign of him anywhere. Even the truck, that single truck that had been parked in the lot every single night of my stay, was gone. The police, I could tell, weren't entirely sure what to make of me. They never said outright that they thought I was inventing the story or that I had been staying there illegally and imagined the whole thing. But the way they spoke, the particular quality of their measured, careful responses, I could feel what they were thinking. And it made me feel worse about that town than I ever had before. I spent the remaining nights of my trip at my brother's place and drove away from that town with no plans to ever return. The whole experience left a mark that I still haven't fully been able to shake. Because when I think back on it now, with the knowledge of what the police found, or more accurately, what they didn't find, I think about those 3 nights. About the open room next to mine. About the footsteps. About the man in the lobby calling me toward him in the dark. And I think about how differently things could have ended if I had simply walked toward him instead of running away. If a story like this has ever made you feel something you couldn't quite explain, drop a comment below and let us know. You are never alone in that feeling, our community here understands it completely. Story 2, Someone was already inside. I took a solo trip the following Christmas to meet my family at a mountain cabin that my parents had owned for many years. It was a cozy little wooden structure tucked into the trees a few hours south of the city, positioned roughly halfway between where I lived and where the rest of my family was coming from. My parents had used it for years as a gathering spot, a place to step away from the noise and just be together. It had a fireplace, a view of the woods, and that particular kind of quiet that only exists far from town. Peaceful is the word I keep coming back to. That was the feeling that cabin carried for me, and peaceful was exactly what I was looking for. The plan was simple. My family was small, just my parents, my sister, and me, and nobody expected a big elaborate celebration. We were going to meet there, spend a few quiet days together over the Christmas holiday, and enjoy each other's company. Since I was making the drive on my own, I had decided to arrive a day early and give myself one full day alone at the cabin before everyone else arrived. Just me, the woods, the fireplace, and a little bit of stillness. 4 days with family, 1 day for myself. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. I arrived 3 days before Christmas, late in the afternoon. The sky was already beginning to darken by the time I parked, and the trees behind the cabin were wrapped in that soft, hazy glow that comes in the last minutes before the sun disappears completely. I didn't have much time before I needed to sleep, so I did a slow walk through the cabin, unpacked my things, took a long hot shower, and went to bed. I slept well and woke up feeling rested and genuinely happy to be there. It had been over a year since anyone in the family had used the cabin. That much time can hide a lot of small changes in a place, especially one that sits empty through long stretches of cold weather. But from a quick look around, everything seemed fine. Nothing was obviously wrong. The cabin felt exactly as I remembered it, warm, slightly rustic, entirely welcoming. Whatever small maintenance things my parents might need to address could wait until they arrived. That morning I wanted to make my one solo day count. I brewed a hot cup of coffee, bundled up against the cold, and set out on foot along the trail that wound through the woods behind the cabin. Our family had walked it so many times over the years that the path had worn itself into something almost formal, a clear, 2-mile loop that moved through the trees and circled back to the front door. The morning was cold and still, with a thin layer of snow that had come down quietly overnight. The only sounds were the wind moving gently through the upper branches and the soft crunch of my own footsteps. I made it about half a mile before I stopped walking. There were marks in the snow ahead of me, right on the trail. At first I thought an animal had come through, a deer, maybe, or something larger. But a few steps closer and the impression became unmistakable. Shoe prints. Clear, deliberate, recently made shoe prints pressed into the thin layer of snow on the path. They had distinct edges, the kind that form when the snow is fresh and hasn't yet had time to soften or blur. I looked around at the surrounding woods. Everything was still. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of anyone nearby. Nobody should have been out there. The property was our family's. The trail was on our land. And yet someone had clearly been walking it, and not long ago. I stood there for a moment, trying to reason through it calmly. It was probably a hunter, I told myself. Someone from a neighboring property who had wandered a little further than they meant to. Or perhaps there was another cabin nearby that I wasn't aware of, and the person had simply been out for a morning walk of their own. There were plenty of reasonable explanations. But even so, I turned around. I didn't want to go further. I didn't want to run into whoever it was out there in the middle of those quiet, empty woods with no one else around for miles. So I started walking back toward the cabin, going over the possibilities in my head, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I was still working on that convincing when I walked up to the front door and nearly dropped my coffee. There were shoe prints coming up to the door. A fresh set, leading directly from the opposite direction, from the other end of the trail, where it looped back around and met the cabin at the front. They came right up to the doorstep and stopped. And they absolutely had not been there when I had left just 30 minutes before. My heart began to hammer. I spun around, looking out at the tree lean, at the white stretch of snow around the cabin, scanning in every direction for any sign of someone standing nearby. The forest was empty and still and utterly silent. Nobody was visible anywhere. But someone had been here. Someone had been here while I was out walking, minutes ago. They had come up to this door while I was away. I threw myself inside and turned the lock with shaking hands. I stood in the hallway for a moment just breathing, waiting for my pulse to come down. Then I picked up my phone and called my parents. My mother's reaction, if anything, made me feel worse. She became more frightened than I was the moment I finished describing what I had seen, which, considering how frightened I already was saying quite a lot. She told me to go to a hotel in the nearest town and wait there until they arrived the next day. My father agreed. Neither of them thought I should stay alone. But I decided to stay. Looking back on that decision now, I recognize it for what it was, stubborn and naive. But in the moment, I convinced myself that I could be careful. I would stay inside. I wouldn't open the doors. I would keep the curtains drawn and wait it out. One night. My family would be there by the next afternoon. It was the longest day I can remember. The cabin that had felt so peaceful the night before now felt like a cage. I sat by the fireplace in the living room with a mug of coffee that I kept refilling, not because I was tired but because I needed something to do with my hands, some small anchor to normalcy. I watched the light change through the windows as the hours crawled by. Every time a branch moved in the wind outside, I felt my whole body go rigid. I didn't read. I didn't watch anything on my phone. I just sat there and stayed alert, because being alert felt like the only thing I could control. The afternoon faded into evening. The sky beyond the windows darkened by degrees until there was nothing outside but black. The fireplace cast a flickering orange light across the walls, and the crackle and hiss of the wood burning was the only sound in the cabin. I was running on too much coffee and too little sleep, and I knew at some point I was going to have to close my eyes. The thought of falling asleep in that space, with the memory of those footprints pressing at the edges of my mind, made my stomach turn. And then I thought of something that I couldn't believe hadn't occurred to me earlier in the day. I had never looked at where the footprints went after they reached the door. I had been so focused on the fact that they had come up to the cabin at all that I hadn't thought to follow the trail in the other direction, to see whether they led back toward the woods, which would mean the person had left, or whether they simply stopped. I got up from the couch. I went to the front door and opened it slowly, just enough to look out. The cold air came in immediately, and the darkness beyond the doorway was thick and deep. The woods at the edge of the property were nothing but shadows layered on shadows. I looked down at the snow and found the shoe prints immediately, right there at the bottom step, still frozen in place where they had been all day. I began to trace them with my eyes, following them back in the direction they had come from. Looking for the point where they turned. Looking for where the person had gone when they walked away. I kept looking. And slowly, without any dramatic moment or sharp realization, the blood drained from my face. The footprints did not lead away from the door. They came right up to the doorstep and then they simply ended. There were no departing prints. No path back into the woods. Just prints arriving, and nothing going the other direction. I stood there in the open doorway with cold air pouring in around me, and two things hit me simultaneously. The shoe prints had stopped at the door, and I had left the cabin unlocked when I went out for my walk that morning. I turned around very slowly and looked back into the dim, firelit interior of the cabin. From somewhere down the dark hallway, I heard a creak. I looked toward it. My bedroom door was open. And there was a man standing in the middle of the hallway, moving slowly and carefully toward the living room where I stood. He hadn't seen me yet. But the moment he did, the moment our eyes found each other, he stopped for just a fraction of a second, and then he ran. He ran directly at me. I grabbed my car keys off the hook by the door in one motion and sprinted to my car. I got in, got it started, and drove. I didn't slow down, didn't look back, didn't stop until the panic in my chest loosened just enough for me to glance in the rearview mirror. The cabin was already gone from sight, swallowed up by the darkness and the distance behind me. I drove to the nearest town and gave a full report to the police. Officers went out to the cabin to investigate. The man, of course, was no longer there. But the officers did find something in my bedroom, scuff marks on the floor of the small standing closet, the kind of marks that form when someone has been standing still in a confined space for a very long time. Their conclusion was that he had been hiding in that closet all day. Waiting. Waiting for the cabin to go quiet, for the lights to go out, for me to fall asleep. And that is where this story leaves us, not with an arrest, not with answers, not with any sense of resolution. Because we never learned who he was. We never found out how he knew I would be there, or whether he had been watching the cabin for some time, or what exactly he had been planning for when the house finally went dark. I try not to think too hard about that last part. But sometimes, late at night, I do. Like this video if any of this gave you a chill, and share it with someone you care about. These kinds of stories remind us to trust our instincts, and that's something worth passing along. Story 3, Something in the Trees. I was somewhere in northern Oregon when it started. I couldn't tell you the exact highway, it wasn't one of the main routes, just one of those narrow, winding back roads that cuts through mile after mile of dense Pacific Northwest forest. The kind of road that feels like it exists between places rather than going anywhere specific. I had been driving for hours, windows cracked just enough to let the cool air keep me alert, music turned down low in the background. It was a road trip without any particular urgency, I was simply moving through the world, clearing my head, taking in some scenery. A few stops here and there, nothing scheduled, nothing demanding. I had been reasonably careful about my fuel level throughout the trip, checking the gauge regularly and making a habit of stopping to fill up when I still had about a quarter of a tank remaining. But somewhere on that empty Oregon road, I misjudged it. I pushed things a little too far, and by the time the low fuel warning light blinked on, I was further from anything than I'd realized. I checked my phone immediately and pulled up the nearest gas station. 45 minutes away. Not great, but I told myself I could manage it. The warning light doesn't mean empty, I reminded myself. There are miles left in that buffer. I kept driving. A while later I glanced at my phone to check my remaining time. 35 minutes. Good. Progress. I kept driving, checked again after another stretch of road. Still 35 minutes. That was odd. I watched the little car icon on the GPS, waiting for it to move. It didn't. I checked again. 35 minutes. The icon was frozen in place, and so was the estimated time. My GPS had lost signal at some point along the road, and it had been quietly sitting on the last moment it had recorded, showing me a time that meant nothing. I started trying to reset it, tapping through the settings and switching modes, keeping one eye on the road while I fumbled with the phone. And then, before I could get it working again, the car shuddered. A deep, reluctant cough from somewhere in the engine, the kind that makes your stomach seize. I held my breath. Maybe it was just the fuel sloshing. Maybe I still had a little left. Maybe. It happened again. And again. And then the engine went completely quiet, and the car rolled forward on momentum alone until I guided it to the side of the road and it stopped. I sat there in total silence for a moment, staring through the windshield at the dark road stretching ahead into the fog. Then I looked out the windows at the forest on either side of me. Dense, dark, and utterly still. No lights anywhere. Not a house, not a light pole, not the distant glow of another town. Just trees and fog and road and silence. I picked up my phone to call for help and spent about 10 full seconds staring at the screen before understanding why my GPS had frozen. No service. Not one bar. Not even a flicker. I set the phone in my lap and took a breath. Then I got out of the car. My reasoning was this: if the GPS had been stuck at 35 minutes for a while before I noticed, then I might have been as close as 10 or 15 minutes from that gas station when the car died. I had a small flashlight in the glove compartment. The road was straight. Walking was my only option, and if I was lucky, I might make it there in half an hour. So I grabbed the flashlight, locked the car manually with my key, and started down the road on foot. The darkness out there was the particular kind that exists only when there are no artificial lights within many miles of you. The fog made it worse, wrapping around the beam of my flashlight and reducing its reach to barely 10 feet ahead of me. The forest pressed in on both sides, a wall of black shapes and shadow that my eyes kept trying to read and interpret. Every time I glanced to the side, I saw movement, shapes that resolved into trees if I looked long enough, but that took just a little too long to resolve and left my pulse elevated in the meantime. I stopped looking to the sides. I fixed my eyes on the road directly ahead and kept walking. 5 minutes in, I heard it. A sound from the woods to my left. Not wind, not the general settling of trees in a breeze, this was something discreet and deliberate. A branch snapping under pressure, then another a moment later. Something was moving through the forest just off the road, pressing through the underbrush, stepping on the debris on the ground. I stopped walking. My flashlight swung toward the sound automatically. The forest went instantly, completely silent. I stood there with the beam aimed at the tree line, my eyes searching the dark spaces between trunks. The longer I stared, the more my mind tried to populate those spaces with shapes, and the more I became convinced that something on the other side of those trees was staring right back at me. I lowered the flashlight and kept moving. Faster this time, though I hadn't quite broken into a run. A few minutes later, I spotted something ahead on the right side of the road. A large shape lying near the trees, low to the ground. My first thought was a fallen log. But as I walked closer and my flashlight beam reached it properly, I stopped walking for a second time. It was a car. An old sedan, dark-colored, sitting well past the shoulder of the road with its front end partly into the tree line. Not violently, not like something that had lost control and crashed, more like someone had driven it there slowly and deliberately and simply left it. The driver's side door was sitting slightly open. The car itself looked like it had been there for a long time, weeks, maybe longer. Grass and debris had gathered against the lower panels. It had settled into its place at the edge of the forest in the way that things do when they stop being tended to. I didn't call out. I didn't shine my flashlight into the trees beyond it. Something very quiet and very firm in the back of my mind told me not to linger, not to search, not to look too long. Whatever had happened here had left no good answers behind, and I didn't want to find out what looking for them might bring. I was still processing all of this when the sounds came again from just behind the abandoned car. Rustling, close and intentional, coming from the bushes at the base of one of the nearest trees. Then more rustling. Then movement. I turned toward it without meaning to. Instinct is a powerful thing, and for a moment I thought I was imagining it. The shadows between the trees were playing tricks again, shapes appearing and dissolving. But then I watched long enough, and I understood that what I was seeing was real. There were figures moving in the trees. Not one. More than one. Multiple shapes, human in outline, running through the forest parallel to the road and just outside the full reach of my light. A group of people, moving through the dark between the trees. Every hair on my body stood up. I did not run. Some part of my brain, operating faster than conscious thought, decided that running would be the wrong choice. I started walking faster, much faster, moving forward with urgency without quite crossing into panic. And I tried not to hear the sounds that started up alongside me, multiple sets of footsteps moving through the forest, keeping pace with me, tracking my movement along the road. I didn't look over. I kept my eyes forward. I kept walking. I never heard the truck coming. The headlights didn't reach me with enough warning, and the engine was quiet enough that the first I knew of it was a loud voice calling through a rolled-down window just to my left, and I must have jumped half a foot off the ground. The truck had pulled up right alongside me and stopped, a regular, dusty old pickup, the kind you see on every rural road in the country. The man behind the wheel was somewhere around 50, a gray-streaked beard, lines around his eyes from years of outdoor work. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been driving for a long time and had seen something he wasn't quite sure about. He asked me what on earth I was doing out there. He said I was a long way from anything, and I looked like I needed help. The moment that truck had stopped, all sound from the forest had ceased. The footsteps. The rustling. Everything. The sudden silence was almost as startling as the sounds had been. I told him the truth. My car had run out of gas back down the road. I was hoping to walk to the nearest station. He let out a short, dry exhale that wasn't quite a laugh, more the expression of someone recognizing a situation that was worse than the person in it understood. He told me to get in. He said the station was much farther than I probably thought. I hesitated for only a moment before getting in. Hitchhiking had never been something I imagined myself doing. But staying out there, alone, on that road, with whatever was moving in those trees, that seemed like a far greater risk. I got in the truck. And he really was just trying to help. That became clear very quickly. He told me he farmed about an hour to the north and drove this particular road frequently. He said he had never once seen someone on foot out here at this hour and had known immediately that something was wrong. He was cautious and straightforward, and there was nothing threatening about him at all. He was just a man who had seen someone who needed help and had stopped to offer it. The drive to the gas station took nearly 25 minutes. If I had kept walking, it would have been hours. If I had kept walking. When we got there, he patted me on the shoulder, wished me luck, and drove off into the night. No strings, no strangeness, no unsettling parting words. Just a decent person doing a decent thing. Inside the station, the attendant on duty strongly suggested I call the local sheriff's office now that I had cell service again. He said the officers in that area were helpful and would gladly drive me back out to my car and make sure everything was safe. I followed his advice, and I am deeply grateful that I did. Because when the officer drove me back out to where I had left my car, we found that it had been moved. It was no longer on the shoulder of the road. It had been pushed or rolled down off the pavement and was sitting at the edge of the tree line, positioned almost exactly the same way the old abandoned sedan had been, as if someone had deliberately moved it there so that passing cars would not see it from the road. Someone, or several someones, had pushed my car into the shadows while I was gone. I told the officer everything then. All of it. The sounds in the forest, the figures between the trees, the footsteps that had followed me along the road. The police filed a report and conducted a search of the area. They found nothing. No suspects. No signs of anyone living or camping nearby. The abandoned sedan had no license plates and no identifying markings of any kind. Nobody in the area had reported seeing anything. There were no leads, no answers, and no real resolution of any kind. And that is where this story ends. Not with closure, but with questions that have no answers. Who were those people in the forest that night? What were they doing out there on a remote stretch of road in the dark? What would have happened to me if that farmer had not come along at exactly the moment he did? I don't know. I genuinely, truly do not know. And I think, honestly, that not knowing is the part that stays with me. All three of these people made it out safely. And in each case, the difference between a terrifying story with a living narrator and something far worse came down to a single choice, a moment of instinct, or a stranger appearing at exactly the right time. Trust that quiet voice inside you. It exists for a reason, and it has been keeping us safe far longer than we have had words for it. What do you think about these stories? Which one got under your skin the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing from you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that bell so you're notified the moment a new story goes up. And if someone in your life loves a good late night story, share this with them tonight. We'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.